Hello, I'm standing here holding a video on my iPad. It shows a picture of an editorial cartoon that ran in the Philadelphia Press in 1898. It shows the American eagle stretching 2,000 miles from tip to tip. And then underneath it, right about here, there's a picture of an American eagle in 1798, and it's stretching tip to tip from the Atlantic Ocean, the East Coast, to about the Mississippi River, a few hundred miles. And the idea is that the United States has grown larger and more powerful in 100 years between 1798 and 1898. In other words, the United States is becoming an empire. And there's a couple other videos about why people supported imperialism or versus opposed imperialism. But ultimately, the people who supported imperialism are going to win out, and the United States is going to form a vast overseas empire. The question is, how did they get there? Well, it actually kind of starts. The United States, first of all, had always kind of behaved like an empire, much like Russia and the Austro-Hungarian empires. They had pushed and expanded across their continent, pushing out indigenous people and imposing their political system on new territory and their economic system. And I live in Texas. Texas used to be part of Mexico, and before it was part of Mexico, it was part of Spain, and before it was part of Spain, it was part of American Indian territories. And so we'd always sort of behaved in a imperialist way. But as far as overseas empires, we weren't so interested in that. In fact, when William Henry Seward purchased Alaska in 1867 on behalf of the United States of America, he wanted to get the Russians out of the North America, is what that boiled down to. People made fun of him. They thought that was the stupidest thing they had ever heard. They called it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox. Now we know there's gold there. Now we know there's oil there. There's fishing opportunities. There's beautiful scenery. But no one knew about those things yet. And so it was just kind of seen as a needless occupation. Another thing that Seward did, because he was pro-imperialism or pro-national expansion, was there was this little island midway across the Pacific that nobody seemed to want. And so he claimed it on behalf of the United States government, called Midway Island. And that's, of course, going to be really important in World War II. We didn't know those things at the time, but people largely ridiculed Seward for this. Well, by the 1890s coming along, under the influence of people like Alfred Thayer Mann, President William McKinley, then President Franklin Roosevelt, after him, the United States is going to become much more imperialistic, much more expansionist. And we're going to begin occupying and controlling overseas territories outside our continental, ocean-to-ocean, manifest destiny, original ideas. And some of the first territories, of course, we're going to get Alaska and Midway, but then there's going to be a little bit of a time period, and then we're going to start leasing territory in the Solomon Islands. And the Solomon Islands are going to be used as coaling stations where as we begin to move to the China trade, we'll have a place to refuel our ships. And there's going to be a few other places that are picked up as well, again, in the South Pacific. But really, our big expansion is going to be in the year 1898. Within the year 1898, we are going to acquire in Asia, we're going to pick up the Philippines. We're going to pick up the island of Guam. We're going to acquire the island of Puerto Rico. And we will acquire Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, all in 1 year. Actually, in one war, under one treaty. We're going to have a war with Spain, which we will talk about in class. And at the end of the war, which the United States will be victorious, it was a very one-sided war that Theodore Roosevelt referred to as a splendid little war. And we're going to now find ourselves in possession of this great global empire. All right, and again, we're going to get parts of Cuba. We're going to get all of the Puerto Rico. Those territories are still part of the United States. We're going to get Guam, which is now semi-independent, autonomous, and the Philippines, which are now their own independent country after World War II. But for the most part, we're going to get those territories. Another thing we're going to pick up in 1898 is the Kingdom of Hawaii. The Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown and formed into a republic. of Hawaii, mostly by American farm owners in sugar plantations. And then when they originally want to join the United States, we say no. And then later we say, hey, you know what? We want you as part of our territory so that we can, number one, keep the Japanese from getting it, and number two, so that we can use it as a coaling station. And then we can get all that sugar and pineapple and, tropical beaches and tropical paradise as a bonus. Again, that's also going to be in 1898. Shortly after that, we're going to see an opportunity to push England out of North America a little bit and Denmark out of North America a little bit. So we are going to purchase from Denmark the Virgin Islands, which are now part of the United States Virgin Islands. We're going to try to buy the British Virgin Islands and Bermuda, and it doesn't work. England's not so interested in giving up territory. So now we have the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, which now we call the Caribbean our ocean. We're also going to pick up the Panama Canal Zone. Panama Canal Zone is going to be in 1900, so 2 years after we acquired the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And we're actually going to pick up the Panama Canal Zone as a direct result of having the Philippines. During the Spanish-American War, there was a warship that left its harbor in Richmond and wanted to go to war in the Philippines, but because there was no transisthmal canal, as they called it, all right, it had to sail all the way south past the Cape of Storms in South America, down near Argentina and Chile, and then up past Hawaii in the Pacific, and then finally get to the Philippines. And by the time it got there, the war was over. Well, we can't have warships that don't get to the war in time, and so the United States helped Panama overthrow a part of Colombia to establish the Republic of Panama, and then we leased the Panama Canal Zone forever. We've since given it back, but forever, and then we began to build a canal across Panama. And it is, I'm going to tell you, I teach engineering at the high school, and the Panama Canal is a wonder in engineering. It is awesome because they have to be able to take boats up a 2,000-foot mountain. And how do you do that? Well, you build a series of locks, which are basically water elevators. And where the boat comes in, they close the gate behind it, they close the gate in front of it, and then they fill that lock with water, and the boat floats up. They open this gate, eek, boat goes into the next lock, they close it, they fill the next lock up with water, and they lift it up to the top of a mountain where there's a huge lake, and they go across the lake, and then they have to repeat the process to go down the other side of the mountain. It's amazing the technology and the engineering that's involved in this, because the ships that go through have 4 feet of clearance on either side, which isn't very much. And it's one of the busiest waterways in the world. It takes about 16 hours to get through. Compare that to 16 weeks to sail south across through the Cape of Storms, south of Argentina and south of Chile. That's a pretty good deal. Well, so we acquired that territory. Now, maintaining an empire, acquiring an empire was, to be honest, pretty easy. Spain, we took a lot of this territory from Spain. Spain was kind of the sick man in Europe and wasn't very strong. During the Spanish-American War, we had steel battleships. They had wooden frigates, and we literally sat at the harbor at Manila, Battle of Manila Bay, and we sank everything that they had. I think we had 3 guys injured when one of the guns exploded on our ship because they misloaded the cannon or something like this. All right, it was very one-sided. More Americans died of diseases during the war, like 168, than died in combat, which was like 4. So acquiring an overseas empire was easy. We purchased the Alaska. We purchased the U.S. Virgin Islands. We signed a treaty with Panama and support so they would get our support for their revolution, and we annexed Hawaii. Maintaining an empire, on the other hand, that's hard. The Filipinos were really kind of interesting. They thought that they should have their own country because, they're Filipinos, it's the Philippines, and they didn't like the Spanish. And so they actually helped the Americans to boot the Spanish out of the Philippines, believing that they were going to then be independent because America was America. And I'm sure they were quite shocked when we announced, we're going to keep you and you're going to become a territory. And so actually what's going to happen is from there, they're going to start a 20-year revolution, well, really a 40-year revolution, trying to throw out America. And it's not until World War II that they stop. World War II, the Filipinos will side with the Americans because they don't like the Japanese any more than they like the Americans. They actually like them a little less. And so they will actually help the United States in the war against Japan. And in return, we do say, you know what, maybe you're right, maybe it should be an independent. And so in 1950, the Philippines becomes their own independent country. Cuba, we conquered Cuba and then didn't keep it, but we kept Guantanamo Bay, which is a really important naval base in the Pacific. We had to increase our Navy in order to control all these territories. And even today, people in Puerto Rico sometimes talk about wanting to become independent, not wanting to be part of the United States. So we find that in the case of American imperialism, acquiring an empire is much easier than maintaining that empire. There is an active separatist movement in Hawaii. In fact, crazy little piece of trivia before I sign out. The Hawaiian Quarter, a few years ago when the United States did their 50-state series of quarters, on the back of the Hawaiian Quarter is a phrase in Hawaiian about beauty of the island, and it's actually a phrase that's used by the Hawaiian separatists to promote independence. And so they kind of slipped that in there because nobody was paying that real close attention. So there you go. So our empire, you could say our empire grew from 1867 until about 1900. But the reality is most of it happened in about a 3-year period between 1898 and 1900. That's when we're going to get the Philippines, Guam, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Panama Canal Zone. So we go from backwards, from tiny to big in a very, very small period of time. But again, acquiring an empire, maintaining an empire, two very, very different facts. And this is illustrated by something called the Insular Cases. One of the big questions that came up during the American Empire was, now that these are territories, are they entitled to all the protections of the U.S. Constitution? And the United States actually ended up sending a bunch of cases to the United States Supreme Court, where, in what was referred to as the Insular Cases, we had to decide which parts of the Constitution are exportable, which parts of the Constitution apply to the places in our empire that were not states. We never had to do this before. And we haven't had to do it since. So there you go. Building an empire, maintaining an empire. Two very different things. Have a great day.